A recent report claims the Chinese government bears state responsibility for an ongoing genocide against the Uyghurs. This is in breach of the United Nations Genocide Convention. The 25,000-word report has been prepared by more than 50 global experts in human rights, war crimes, and international law. It was released by the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy think tank in Washington, D.C. The Uyghur genocide is the series of human rights abuse perpetrated by the Chinese government against the Uyghur people and other minorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Since 2014, the Chinese government has been accused of persecuting more than 1 million Muslim Uyghurs without any legal process. According to the US State Department, up to 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities have been placed in a large number of detention centers across the region. Former detainees allege they were subjected to indoctrination, sexual abuse, and even forceful sterilization. The European Union has slapped sanctions on 4 Chinese officials over Uyghur abuses. The sanctions involve freeze of their assets in the EU and a ban on them from traveling in the bloc. Despite a growing body of evidence, China has denied committing the atrocities and abuses against the Uyghur Muslim minority. It rejects the genocide charge and says the centers are necessary to prevent religious extremism and terrorism. With the global community coming together behind the legal report on Uyghurs saying that China is breaching every article in the Genocide Convention, it is yet to be seen what the future will hold for China and how it will deflect these charges. Bureau Report, Democracy News Live, New Delhi.
Good evening, I'm Rohit Gandhi and you're watching Democracy News Live. Welcome to our show, It Matters. Today we're doing a show around the Uyghur genocide in China. According to legal report, the Chinese government bears responsibility for committing genocide against the Uyghurs. The report was published by a non-partisan think tank based in the United States. The report says that China has breached all provisions of UN Genocide Convention in Xinjiang. As per the UN Convention signed by 152 countries, including China, a finding of genocide can be made if a party violates one of the 5 defined acts. The report by the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy found that the Chinese Communist Party had violated all of them. It accused the party of clearly demonstrating an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. The Institute said, in creating the report, all available and verifiable evidence was studied by dozens of experts on international law, genocide studies, and Chinese ethnic policies. It made no recommendations. Mass deaths, sexual abuse and torture interrogations, indoctrination, and forced sterilizations have been cited in the report. This has led to an outburst of anger from countries all across the world. Joining us to discuss the issue, we have with us Ahmer Shaheen. He is based in Pakistan. He's a veteran journalist. You have to remember, Pakistan has voiced its opinion on Kashmir or the violations of human rights, but stays quiet on the Uyghurs mostly. So he's joined us today. Our second guest is Manoj Kewalramani. He is an Indian analyst who heads China Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. We also have with us Dr. Neelmani Jaysawal. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Social Work, Vishwa Bharati at Sriniketan. Thank you, all of you, for joining me. Let me first bring in Manoj here. Manoj, please weigh in. Give us a little background on why China has this reaction and what is going on in Xinjiang.
Hi Rohit, thank you for having me here. I think if we look at this issue, we can go back hundreds of years, because this is really, really deep history, and this is about when sort of Chinese integration of this territory, which is Xinjiang now, took place under the Qing dynasty. But let's come back to the modern PRC, and we see that when the PRC was formed, there was this sense of concern and anxiety with regard to what was seen as the softer exteriors, whether it was Tibet, whether it was Xinjiang. And that assimilation was problematic. And there were a number of policies that were adopted. One of those was obviously Han migration to these regions, because these were regions with different ethnic minorities within the sort of broader China. And you had policies with regard to provision of autonomy and commitments of autonomy under Mao Zedong, which sort of allowed for this integration to take place. Of course, there was also military force that was used. If I was to sort of fast forward to more recent times, the current situation, the evolution of that sort of dates back to around 2009, 2008, 2009. There's been tremendous Han migration over the years. In 2008, 2009, you see a certain restiveness taking place in this part of the country. You see riots in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang. And after those riots, you see the Chinese leadership sort of have serious concerns about stability and about the potential loss of territory, because you also see subsequently the Arab Spring, the war on terrorism sort of creates anxiety within them because of the spread of sort of religious fundamentalism. And all of that sort of forms this nasty cocktail, where there's this threat of religious extremism, threat of a potential color revolution, which is supported by the West. And that sort of leads to a reaction. And you see the government starting to get tougher on its policies with regard to ethnic minorities, particularly the Uyghurs. You also see in the next couple of years a series of terrorist attacks starting from 2011. And those are really rudimentary in nature compared to sort of the terrorist attacks that we in India have experienced over the last 30 odd years at least. Yet they sort of shake the Communist Party. And what you see is a campaign which is called the Strike Hard campaign, which begins it begins fairly early in 2009, 2010, and then subsequently that intensifies. And the idea is therefore to sort of control religion, to synthesize society, and to be able to promote integration while also maintaining law and order. Now, I'm going to sort of fast forward to Xi Jinping and when he comes to power. In 2014, again, a year where you have serious attacks in China, across China. There's an explosion in Beijing where a car rams into the Tiananmen Square rostrum. And again, that shakes up the party. There's an attack on a railway station in Kunming, which is in Yunnan province. And you have that was dubbed as China's 9/11. And you see a very, very strong response from the Communist Party. In 2014, you see Xi Jinping holding the second Xinjiang Work Symposium, where he essentially lays out a threefold strategy. He talks about, firstly, law and order. And I'm going to quote him. He says, we're going to be creating walls made of copper and steel and nets that spread from the earth to the sky. And he talks about that as his legal and security foundation. He talks about fostering a patriotic clergy. So there is about religious reform, which is much more syncretized. He talks about reinforcing ethnic unity by de-emphasizing local ethnic identity. And he stresses that the importance of residents in Xinjiang, particularly the Uyghurs, who constitute about 49% of the population, to identify themselves more with China and Chinese culture and socialism as opposed to necessarily their religious and ethnic identity. And the last prong of this strategy is obviously development, provision of jobs, creation of infrastructure, public services, and so on and so forth. And subsequently, you see this, in the years to follow, you see this so-called de-radicalization campaign, which leads to people being incarcerated. And that incarceration, as some of the scholars who've recently been sanctioned, some of the European scholars who've been sanctioned by Beijing, have clearly documented this build of infrastructure for incarceration, the policy for incarceration, the gradation of threat identification, and how Beijing's gone about doing that. And just my last point right now is that in 2020, you saw Xi Jinping hold his next Xinjiang Work Symposium. And in that, he essentially gave himself a pat on the back. And he said that our policy is absolutely correct. And we'll be continuing with this. So that, in a nutshell, is what's been going on.
Sure. So let me bring in Ahmer here. Ahmer, Pakistan obviously has continued to make a lot of noise in Kashmir when it comes to human rights violations, whenever there has been any sight of it in India. But obviously, in China, because of the close relationship with the Chinese, Pakistan seems to not open its mouth at all. It's not as if journalists don't write about it. I've seen enough newspaper articles in Pakistan write about it, but the government makes no noise whatsoever. Can you please explain this? If Pakistan says it stands for the Islamic identity, it's an Islamic nation, Why does it stay quiet on China?
And it's not just an analysis or an observation. It's an actual fact that has been relayed many times on Pakistani television channels and in newspapers, where journalists specifically ask the Prime Minister of Pakistan and other political leaders, selected political leaders, about the plight of Muslims in China, the Uyghur community, and it's very surprising that even if I was supposed to, not speak about something, I'll come a little prepared as to how I would deflect that question. And the way the current regime has been deflecting that question is by simply saying, who are these people? We're not aware of who Uyghurs are or what's happening to them. We're not aware of any atrocities happening to them. And it came to the point where journalists kind of, respectfully asked them to stop kidding around and have a proper statement about the Uyghur, treatment in China. And that's when the Prime Minister of Pakistan said that this is Chinese internal matter and we would not want to address it because Chinese are very sensitive people, and that's what his response was. So after all this while, he kind of admitted that he knows who Uyghur people are and what's happening in China, but he doesn't want to talk about it. And then obviously there is civil society in Pakistan, and Pakistan did on the public level raise this issue, not as a as a government but as a group of people, civilians. And this is when Chinese responded by telling Pakistani government to, they take control of the people who are creating all this fuss. So basically, whatever China is doing, they should do it to those who are supporting the Uyghur cause in Pakistan. Now, China, if you look at the crux of what China is trying to do, I may surprise you by saying that what it wants to do, what China wants to do, is very legitimate. But the way China is doing all of that, suppressing the voice and the freedom of religion of the Uyghur people, is the worst that they could do. And I mean, I've always seen Chinese economy and government as a big businessman, people who really take care of their business interests. And it makes zero sense to me why they would be so blatant about the atrocities. Of course, there is, all the numbers and the figures that we get, all the forced conversions, all the indoctrination, all those numbers, we have to take it with a pinch of salt because there is no media freedom in China. And all those census numbers and all those other details that come to us, which is still very appalling, is also coming from a place where it is not possible for people like you and I to go and observe. They offered the United Nations to come and observe that there's no torture happening on the community. But the United Nations, like all of us, like our countries, India, Pakistan, we're all failing the Uyghur community because it's all about real estate.
When you say,
Pakistan can see what's happening in Kashmir.
Emmer, I'll let you speak on this, but tell me, when you say what China is trying to do is legitimate, can you explain that to me a bit, and then you can certainly continue.
What China, on the grassroots level, what it intends to do is to fight terrorism, because there have been instances of terrorism. Now, what it's doing wrong is banning all the terrorist activities to a certain community and giving them a whitewash maltreatment, which is repeating, something very close to the Holocaust. And I mean, what they're trying to do, I perhaps I shouldn't say legitimate without explaining it for like quite some time. That legitimate in terms of China has the right to take actions that do not violate human rights. China has a right to take actions against terrorism like any other country does. But what China essentially is doing is terrorizing a whole community and ethnically cleaning a whole community to, counter terrorism. And for somebody like me, I would see that as terrorism itself. The world knows China as a country that wants to, like, its first priority is business. So the world leaders are very wary of upsetting China. Even when UK, Canada, and US, when they impose sanctions, we don't really expect too much coming out of those sanctions. But when you talk about a country like Pakistan, Pakistan is not going to take a stand because the current regime is not in any position to take any stand. The only stands that they take, even the recent stand that they've taken, that they need to be friendlier towards India. It was the chief of army staff who came out with this stand before the foreign minister and the prime minister started talking about it. So Pakistan's stand, Pakistan's heavy investment on the Gwadar port and the economic corridor. The main stakeholders are the military establishment, and there is absolutely no way that a puppet government of the military establishment is going to bark at the very friends of the military establishment, that is the Chinese Communist Party. And there's absolutely no way that they'll be able to see what's happening with the Uyghur community the way they can easily see what's happening in Kashmir. Of course, there are breaches of human rights happening in Kashmir, and perhaps those are the only ones we can see in Pakistan, or the powers that be can see in Pakistan. We cannot see Balochistan, we cannot see Uyghur.
Right. No, you have good points there, Ahmer. Let me bring in Professor Jaysawal here. Professor Jaysawal, explain to us, as we look at it from a UN perspective, as we look at it from a human rights perspective, has China been doing this for a long time? Yes, it has. There has been certain challenges around religion for China. In China, at many, many levels, religion is considered like a no-go zone. They rather be without a religion, at least on the government side or on the Communist Party side. But again, anytime China sees a religious community, whether it's the Christians, whether it's Muslims, even Buddhists for that matter, what we've seen in Tibet unfold, we've seen that China has an extremely negative response. Churches have had tremendous amount of pressure on them. So explain to me, when we hear about China now putting excessive pressure on the Uyghurs, what's the academic community? How does the academic community look at these human rights?
Yeah, very good evening, Mr. Gandhi and our fellow panelists. As you rightly pointed out, that the perspective of China has witnessed a lot of paradigmatic shift in the current paradigm. First, we have to see the Uyghur community in the perspective of their historical evolution, and then we can come out with the current notions how they are going through. If we see the evolution of Uyghur community, we'll find that they have come from Mongolia, and earlier they had the origin in the 17th century from Mongolia, and today they came into the province of Xinjiang, and this Muslim community had a lot of affinity with the population of Turkey, and they had that kind of affinity. So now, if you see the perspective of China, they are having this kind of notion that if this kind of affinity with the Muslim religion is going much forward, definitely it will create a fundamentalism in Xinjiang province, and which will be a kind of probable fear for the Han population. So having this viewpoint that the Muslim community may outnumber the Chinese in that province, because we know that Xinjiang province has always been the autonomous region till 1884, when China started occupying on that, and after the People's Republic of China came into existence in 1949, we saw that the entire province has been under the administrative control of the Chinese. So definitely they have this kind of fear psychosis in their mind that the Muslim fundamentalism will outwit the Chinese ideologies, and the integrity to their communist regime will be in the threat. So if you see today the violations by the Chinese government and the repressive structure of China in terms of their religious freedom of Uyghur community, their freedom of movement, we will find that everywhere there are a lot of human rights violations. Like our fellow panelist also pointed out that how the Chinese regime is saying them from the perspective of a lot of suspicion. If we see even the regulations of 2004, which is brought out in China regarding the religious regulations, they had also moved ahead a lot before the 1990s regulations in terms of regulating the entire religious institution and religious preachings. That any religious preaching or any publication of religious context has to go through the Chinese regime, and the Chinese regime has to approve those kinds of preaching. So if we see these kinds of activities of China, in those Uyghur community, definitely it's very much repressive, because we know that we are living in the world of now democracy, where the decolonization has happened, and we do not have this kind of notions of imperialism. But still in China, especially in these provinces, that imperialistic notion of capturing your thought process, repressing your ideologies and freedom of speech has been there as one of the perennial problem in this province. Also, from the point of view of the economic repression, if you see, we know that Xinjiang province is having a lot of probability in terms of oil and natural gas exploration. So from economic point of view, it's very beneficial for China. So what they are doing, they are extending their Han population to Xinjiang province, and try to place all the Chinese community people into various posts, and as well as the employment opportunities. So from economic point of view also, their freedom, their opportunities have been curtailed by the existing regime. So
it is
in a
absolutely one
gesture,
of the
we can
ways.
see that at the UN level, we are having a lot of violations, not only from the religious point of view, but also from economic and political point of view in this province.
And one of the things that has been observed over the years, and it's been quoted around the world whenever issues around ethnicity and population come, Xinjiang is used as an example. What the Chinese government did was give a lot of the Han funds to go and live in Xinjiang. And they had a little fund. If you went to live there, there wasn't a job, they would still fund you. They'd give you money for a home, they'd give you money for food. And that is how they seem to impact the population, even though the rest of the world looked at it and criticized it. But it's been used as an example in many other parts of the world. Is take the population, flood that population with other kinds of populations from that nation, and then make the population a minority in itself. It's happened in the past. This is not the last time this is going to happen, but it's going to continue happening. But like, I was talking to Manoj earlier before we started the show, he said there was a lot of negative feedback for the Chinese government when they started doing it, and they weren't able to do it successfully. Manoj, do you want to weigh in on this whole approach by the Chinese government to change the population landscape of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been something that they started very, very early on. I mean, it was as soon as the PRC was formed, there was this understanding, and there was a desire to try and sort of contain and control your autonomous regions while granting them autonomy in some way. And this was a negotiation that went on for a while. I mean, from data point of view, what we see is that in 1949, Han population in Xinjiang was around 5% of the province's total. By 1978, it was 40%. And it remains around that level, a little bit up and down. There were lots of ways in which the Communist Party sort of incentivized Han people to travel. I mean, there was obviously there was government migration, there was decommissioning of troops and allowing them to stay there. There was support provided in terms of employment. There was money given in terms of discounts on land prices, subsidies if you're going to migrate there and set up your companies. And you're going to trade over there. Now with Belt and Road, there is more facilities available. People were allowed to sort of establish farms, create transport sort of facilities and all of that. Yet what you saw was that the Han tended to cluster amongst themselves. So you didn't really address the problem that you wanted to. You created ghettos and clusters, and that obviously intensifies the problems because certain clusters are much more well off, certain clusters are not well off at all. And that then intensifies the sort of economic differences, and those become far more stark and far more evident. And that creates its own sort of social friction. And that's been the case. And it's not like the Han population has been ready, willing, and raring to go there. So therefore, what you also see right now is that among the sort of policies that you're seeing, and this is something that they're also doing with Tibet, is that they're trying to see if they can get the Uyghurs to go out to other parts of the country and stay over there and sort of try and assimilate in that fashion. And that creates its own frictions when you go to a different community and you try and settle over there. And particularly, this is more so in the case of Tibet, where they've tried to do this much more forcefully. And it's created its own problems. And it's not just these two provinces. Even in Inner Mongolia, there have been reports of students being harassed or being made to feel that you're not Chinese enough. And those tensions sort of exist. I wanted to sort of add to a couple of things with regard to how Beijing has reacted to this situation. So, I mean, all of the panelists have spoken about this. My thought about religion is that I don't think Beijing has a problem with private religion per se. I don't think the Communist Party has a problem with that. its concern with regard to religion is essentially the potential for any ideology to become a mobilizing force. And when it sees religion gaining traction to be able to mobilize even in a certain local area, then you see crackdowns, whether it was with sort of the churches about 10, 11 years ago, whether it is with regard to the Uyghur Muslims right now, whether it is with regard to Buddhism, or whether it is with regards to its relationship with the Vatican. Its primary concern has been with regard to the potential for mobilization and the ability to lose political control in that context. With regard to Xinjiang in specific, apart from the economic reasons which Professor Jaysawal spoke about, um, I wanted to talk about how the Chinese have engaged internationally. And their strategy has shifted quite significantly in a very short period of time. It is in 2018 that we started reading about these internment camps, the possibility, the potential of 1 million people being housed in these internment camps, which the Chinese call re-education centers. Beijing initially just flat out denied everything. They said, no, none of this is happening. This is fiction. It's somebody's imagination. It became harder to deny when you had to defend it at the UN in 2018 August. There was a meeting at a UN committee on ethnic rights and discrimination. And at that committee, if you read the testimonies given by Chinese officials, they basically denied and then sort of start talking about how this is to create employment opportunities, create employability, skill development, and so on and so forth. Soon after that, they sort of went to a strategy of obfuscation where they spoke about, well, look, this is about dealing with terrorism and we've done a really, really good job. And, you folks in the West can actually learn from us because this is a model that has worked. And they sort of spoke about de-radicalization centers in France and talked about, well, if you can do it, we can also do it. And actually, we provided success. And that sort of resonates in the white paper that they released on Xinjiang later, in which they said that for 3 or 3.5 years now, we've had not a single terrorist attack. It's a testimony to our success. Following that, obviously, when nobody really bought that, there was an attempt at the same time sort of manage public opinion. This is done by media investments. This is done by ambassadors and diplomats writing articles in different newspapers, including in India. This is done by mobilizing public opinion through not just media investments, but also purchasing and threats to media outlets, which happened in South Africa, which happens in Eastern Europe. And obviously the fact that in certain parts of the world, and it's in large parts of the world, the media is under pressure financially. And the Chinese have been willing to sort of say, well, okay, we'll provide you the Chinese coverage. And people are interested in China coverage. And that's sort of, you leverage that space. Finally, what we're seeing today, which is very different from all that I've spoken about, what we're seeing today, particularly in the last few days, this has been very, very apparent, is a contest and confrontation with the West over the idea of human rights and democracy. If you note the statement that Lavrov and Wang Yi have signed, it's very, very clear. It's got the first 2 points talk about human rights and the fact that nobody has a sort of monopoly on human rights. And the second is about democracy. And the idea is that, look, we can do things based on our national conditions. The primary goal is sustainable development. And it's not on any of these so-called universal values. And that's what the Chinese are pushing back on. So it's no longer just denying, being defensive. It's also being aggressive to say, we will shape the values of the world going forward. And and we will use these as examples to shape the values of the world going forward. And that's, to me, is not just threatening the sort of consensus that has existed post the World War, a difficult consensus on values like human rights, but it's going to sort of create a far more destabilizing environment for minorities around the world.
Sure. No, I see that. And, there is certainly, we've also seen Asian hate crimes in the United States. The whole world post the pandemic seems to be dealing with a lot of challenges. And we're seeing lines and within communities and within ethnic groups. And that in itself is posing a challenge to the world the way it exists. Ahmer, my question to you, we see a lot of the, if you want to call them terrorist groups, separatist groups, operate out of Pakistan, which operate in India when we talk about Kashmir. Similarly, there are some Uyghur groups that operate within Pakistani territory. They at least go back and forth. How are they allowed to function there? Because if they are allowed to function as openly as the groups that work in Kashmir, then the Chinese are going to be very, very angry with Pakistan. So explain to me, how is that relationship managed?
I personally don't think that is the case. The way Jamaat-ud-Dawa and Lashkar-e-Taiba and all the other offsets of these terrorist organizations were managed, given public space. They were allocated lands on the footpaths to have their donation boxes placed and their mini offices placed. We were called in by very powerful people and threatened if we published any reports against them, especially on the front page, which I loved doing. So all of this was happening, but it hasn't happened on the other front. We do not. I've never had interaction with Uyghur freedom fighters on, as a citizen of Pakistan, but I have met hundreds and thousands of Jamaat Dawa and Lashkar-e-Taiba supporters, officials operating publicly, making fun of media and claiming that the government and the military backs them. So so there, I don't think there is a comparison on the state level kind of open support to these freedom fighters. I think there are selected groups, not mainstream groups, not helped by the state, at least not officially. At least we haven't been able to link those two together yet. So and it's more on a organizational level than the state level, and they don't have big training camps, I'm assuming here, because if they did, we would have stumbled upon a few. So it's a little different, because we have to understand, even as media organizations, when we are accused of falsely accused of blasphemy or treason and all of those dangerous accusations that need not be proven before you get killed. Every time that happens, it's the same Jamaatul Dawa and Lashkar-e-Taiba and all those Hafizes who come out on the street if we are seen to be speaking even against military oppression, for example. So there, we call it a military mullah alliance, where the mullah, the religious leader, and the military are in cohorts with each other, but not the ones who are training fighters allegedly, because we've never come across them. We've been to training camps, we've made reports about them, but never to Uyghur training camps. And that's because the Prime Minister doesn't know who the Uyghur people are.
That's sarcastic, but that's the way it is. And I understand that perspective as well. So the operations of the Uyghurs is very, very tiny. It's minuscule. It's at an organizational level and not at a state level. And they function pretty much under the radar, even when they work out of
Yes,
Pakistan.
I wanted to speak about the ethnic cleansing and the demographic shift that has been happening. I mean, it's important to speak against this demographic shift, but we also need to understand that this same demographic shift is happening much more closer to us. For example, the senator from Balochistan recently revealed that around 4 million people have been kind of readjusted in Balochistan, to change the demographics, to change the majority into a minority. Same is happening in Kashmir, where even laws have been changed now, where the last report I read, there were 25,000 people given certificates that they can actually, their domicile was changed into Kashmir. So it's happening to Uyghurs as well. It's condemnable. But I
And
think as
absolutely.
journalists, we really need to create
And
more noise about what's happening closer to us. But obviously, not shying away from this subject,
no,
but we
not at
need to
all.
put a
And
lot more voice and emphasis that it's happening in my neighborhood, it's happening in China, it's not acceptable, but it's happening in my country and your country as well.
sure, absolutely. And one of the quotations, and the people quote the Uyghur change in population size, and when the laws were changed around in Kashmir, a large part of the population continued to talk about it, about how Kashmir can now have a lot of other Indians who can be residents, just the way Kashmiris can become residents anywhere else in India. And certainly it was talked about, and it is certainly one of the ways sometimes governments will try to assimilate or sometimes try to overrun populations. And it's something which has been used in the past, it continues to be used, and absolutely everybody must talk about it. Professor Jaysawal, let me let you weigh in. Can the international community put enough pressure on China to not carry out, as they've been accused, of the genocide against the Uyghurs?
Yeah, well, regarding the international pressure, it's all about the perception. Like today, we see that we are having a lot of international issues across the world in terms of violations of the human rights law and all those things. So in terms of Uyghur community also, if developed nations, especially US, wants to have some impact on that, they definitely can have. And the reports which have been released by even Human Rights Watch, and if you find different kinds of statements given by even the US president and their the State Department, you will find that they have definitely been putting much pressure on the Chinese governance to have a certain kind of human rights compliance in the Uyghur community. Like even if you see the statement given by President Bush, he has also told the Chinese regime at that point of time that any persecution of the minorities in the name of the religious fundamentalism cannot be accepted. So definitely the Chinese governance have to restore the normalcy in the existing province. If you see the repatriation and the deportation of the Uyghur community on the pressure of the Chinese from various countries like Nepal and even from Turkey also, we will find that there have been a lot of human rights violations after their repatriation. Like some of the people have been even executed and they have been hanged. So it's somewhere it is definitely having some impact on the human rights violations. And if the developing nations, with the assistance of the developed country, create an alliance specifically for taking care of the refugee issues and also the Uyghur communities issues, definitely there could be a lot of heightened pressure on China, because
Right.
as we know that human rights violations issues have been rampant across the globe. So not only the Uyghur community but also the communities which are facing these kinds of problem, the developed nations along with the developing countries can create an alliance to respond to that. Because in the previous times, since China adopted the 2004 regulations to persecute the minorities in the name of fundamentalism, and also started displacing the Uyghur community from their economic interests and economic rights, very few nations have spoken for that. And we have seen that a lot of repatriation have been sanctioned by the developed nations after the call of the Chinese, especially in September 11, 2001 issues, that in the name of terrorism they have tried to justify their repressive structure on the Uyghur community. But today the time has changed. We cannot go on the similar front. So today, the regime, which is more pro development and pro growth and inclusive in nature, definitely have to have some emphasis on China to regulate themselves and try to provide certain autonomy to different regions. Like even in Hong Kong, also, if you see, a lot of autonomy related issues have cropped up, and it has been a matter of wider debate across nations, even the issues of Tibet also. So definitely these autonomous regions which have been forced by the Chinese in terms of the economic power, in terms of the political power, and they have tried to enforce their communist regime there, can only be tackled through a very strong coalition between the developed and developing nations, like Quad like regime like India and other nations like US and Australia have created a Quad like alliance to deal with various issues emerging in the Pacific region. So definitely these issues of repatriation and the repression of certain minorities in certain nations, especially in context of the Uyghur community, our country along with the developed nations can work on that. Because definitely it's a huge human rights violations which cannot be tolerated at any scale at the international level.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jaysawal. Thank you, Manoj Kewalramani. Thank you, Ahmer, for joining us for this show. It's an important issue. We have to remember that the minorities, the religious minorities in China have been suppressed, and it's not the first time it's happening. It's happened with the Tibetans. Now it's happening with the Uyghurs. China certainly has a perspective on this. It has a very fine balance to walk with the Pakistani government, obviously because the Pakistani government is an Islamic regime, and it becomes a challenge. But at the same time, the rest of the world is standing up for the Uyghur community, even though some nations, because of their close relationship with China, may not stand against it. And we at Democracy News Live will continue bringing you this story, and we'll continue watching this violation of human rights in Xinjiang. Thanks for watching. Good night and good luck.